giving me the opportunity this morning to talk to you about closing the achievement gap, helping at-risk students meet the Common Core state standards in English language arts. So I am a specialist in English language learners. So in part, I'm really going to focus on that particular population. But in the work we do with English language learners, we always think about all students, and we start there. What do we need to do to help all students meet challenging standards? And from there, we think about what additional supports English language learners might need to meet those standards. And in fact, many of the methods that we use with English language learners are methods that work well for students who also are struggling in school. So you'll see that as we go through this time together we have this morning. And I'm so glad that this room is set up the way it is, that you're sitting at tables where you can speak with people, because I'm the kind of presenter that really likes to give people opportunities to talk about what I'm talking about. It's the way I like to teach. I was a classroom teacher for 10 years, actually in California, and I really believe in giving people opportunities to talk and collaborate, because that's how you're going to really think about and process what I'm saying and sort of move the dialogue further. Okay, so my presentation is going to, so here's an overview for you. I'm going to talk about creating exemplary lessons, and the frame we use for that is the EQUIP rubric, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And you've got a copy of that in your handout. You might want to take a look at that. I'm not going to get ahead of myself here with EQUIP, but just to say that it is a rubric that's being used by 35 states, and it covers about 85% of the U.S. school-age population. And it was developed to help folks rate curriculum and instructional methods to see how well aligned they are with the Common Core. And I saw this rubric when it was in its early stages of development. It was developed by 3 states, Rhode Island, New York, and Massachusetts, I believe, and spearheaded originally by Achieve, who is the same organization that is in charge of sort of developing the PARCC assessment. And I really liked it, in part because it really calls out the importance of instructional supports for students, not just students who are struggling to meet standards, but students who are gifted and really need to be sort of pushed beyond the standards. And when I saw that they had a whole focus on instructional supports, I thought, this is the rubric for me. The other reason I really liked it is that it's very manageable. It's 1 page. And so you can sort of see what they're up to, and that's why I've included it for you, and we'll talk a little bit about it in a minute. I'm going to talk mostly about the key shifts in the Common Core and instructional supports. And if you look at the rubric, those are categories 2 and 3. And I'll say a little bit about alignment to the depth of the Common Core and assessment, but not much, because I really want to give you all opportunities to talk with each other. That's why you're here. You've come from all parts of the state, and I want to make sure we have time for that. So my talk really will focus on these key shifts, which have to do with reading text closely and text-based evidence, writing to sources, academic vocabulary. So because I'm a researcher, I always try to base the methods we use in research, and I was sort of caught off guard. I've been actually driving around the Midwest all week. I realized that I had to be in Northwest Arkansas, Iowa, and sort of central Illinois all in the same week. It just sort of happened that way. And the best way for me to get from one place to another was by car. So I enlisted my husband to drive me around, which was really sweet of him, because I knew that I was going to be really sort of focused on giving various keynotes and working with districts. But in a talk that I was giving in Iowa, in Des Moines, for folks from around the state, they sort of caught me off guard and said, well, you're talking to us about all these methods, and how do you know that they work? And I thought, I'm such a researcher at heart, and I'm so invested on making sure that, the research findings actually influence instruction. It never occurred to me really to talk about research. So I have this slide that talks about research, and while the methods that I'm showing you have not been tested in a randomized controlled trial study, that's the kind of research I actually do, the methods that I've sort of brought to bear in creating this model are grounded in research. 10 years of research funded by the National Institutes for Child Health and Development focused on developing literacy in second language learners. I was the program project director for that 10-year effort. And then also was a member of the research center funded by the Institute for Education Sciences that focused on English language learners, having done about 7 years of experimental research focused on developing science knowledge in ELLs. So while these methods haven't been tested specifically, the methods themselves are based on probably 15 years of research in developing literacy and content knowledge in English learners. So I'll leave it there. But I did want to talk about sort of what is the research base for these methods for sort of effective instruction for second language learners. And again, one of the things that we found is that, and this is based on the National Literacy Panel, Tim Shanahan and I were sort of co-chairs of that panel. What we found is you've got to start on research-based methods that are effective for all students. You can't just develop things for English learners, or actually any other population, I don't think, without starting with really good practice. And I was thinking about, what am I going to say about good practice? And I thought, what we do, and it's funny, all the research on English learners, everybody sort of says the same thing, but in different ways. And so I've been trying hard to figure out how to talk about the kinds of supports we provide in a way that resonates with sort of the research literature on those supports, not specific to English learners. And actually the protocol that I found most useful for this was the Universal Design for Learning protocol, which was developed by CAST. And I looked at it, and I'm doing some work with New York State, helping the state scaffold their K-12 curriculum for English learners. And it turns out that using that Universal Design for Learning rubric that they developed to think about how you support all students and how you create curriculum that works for all students, I think works very well for talking about additional supports for ELs as well as all students who are struggling. And for those of you not familiar with the UDL framework, it has three major categories. The importance of multiple means of representation. So for example, if you're presenting information visually, that students sort of hear about that information at the same time, have a chance to write about that information. Multiple means of action and expression. Some students do better talking, some do better writing, but giving kids opportunities to express themselves in ways that particularly work for them. And then multiple means of engagement. So in fact, for that New York State project, we took the UDL framework and provided lots of examples for how that framework could be used to really talk about supports for English learners. And I like it because it really makes the work, the scaffolding work we do for English learners really relevant to sort of tied into what we need to do for all students. So again, all that work that Tim and I and the panel did on what do you need to do for English learners is build on effective methods for all students. And for me, those effective methods include additional support, and we're conceptualizing additional support in terms of this UDL framework. And I like doing that because it really talks about how you create curriculum from the beginning that works for all students who really need that support, instead of coming in, after you've got curriculum that's been developed that isn't really supportive of kids and have to do a whole lot of scaffolding. It's really trying to convince people to think about developing curriculum and instructional methods that work for all students from the beginning. And using the UDL framework, I think, is a really great way to do that. So again, all the research we did focuses on research-based methods used for all students, but provide additional support. And that additional support we're conceptualizing really, and I think the research supports this, in terms of creating curriculum and instruction with multiple means of representation, multiple means of action and expression, and multiple means of engagement. The other thing we found in all the research we did, so this panel report we did summarized all the research from 1980 through 2002. I want to, for those of you who aren't aware of it, the Department of Education has just released a new practice guide focused on English learners. And you have access to this presentation. You can go to the Department of Ed website. It's called Teaching Academic Content and Literacy to English Learners in Elementary and Middle School. It was just released about a month ago. And it, again, one of the main points that they make I have put up here for you, because it's the one that really resonates to me and I think in a sense subsumes the other major conclusions they have, is that the importance of integrating oral and written English language instruction into content area teaching. So for ELs, the first thing is sort of how do you create curriculum that provides additional support, but then the importance also of thinking in teaching content area to students, helping them meet high standards in content areas, is how do you integrate oral and written English language instruction into this content area teaching. And I've got sort of 4 bullets here that talk about some of these supports. So strategically use instructional tools such as short videos, visuals, and graphic organizers to anchor instruction and help students make sense of content, to explicitly teach content-specific academic vocabulary, as well as the general academic vocabulary that supports it during content area instruction, to provide daily opportunities for students to talk about content in pairs or small groups, and provide writing opportunities to extend student learning and understanding of the content. So for ELs, I mean, to summarize for you all the research really that's been done, and these studies were all experimental studies, so what have we learned? Start with good instruction for all students, provide additional support so that students understand the content that they're supposed to be learning, and then to integrate oral and written English language instruction into content area teaching. So for me, those are sort of the main take-home messages about the research literature. And you can see as I go through this presentation sort of how we try to instantiate these research findings. So the EQUIP rubric, you might want to take a look at it now. As I mentioned, it's now sort of being overseen by the American Diploma Project, and it's sort of standards to ensure curriculum aligns to the Common Core, and also it includes a rubric to rate curriculum. And if you go onto the EQUIP website, there's lots of other information related to sort of how to do this. And there are 4 central foci: alignment to the depth of the Common Core, key shifts in the Common Core state standards, instructional supports, and assessment. And I always try to provide graphic organizers in my talk so people can follow what I'm doing. We're going to really focus on key shifts and instructional supports, and I'm going to talk a little bit about alignment to the depth of the Common Core. The text we're going to work with is called The Voice That Challenged a Nation by Russell Friedman, and we're going to work with an excerpt from that text. And again, I'm going to give you opportunity to read through that text. You have that in your handout. So I want you to read through it because without reading through it, you won't really understand the kinds of methods that I'm talking about. So I'm going to give you a minute just to read through it, and then I'm going to use this to model how to provide additional support for kids to close the achievement gap. Okay, so we're going to talk about text complexity, but let me explain why. In the first part of this rubric, one important part of the rubric is alignment to the depth of the Common Core state standards. And what they mean by alignment to the depth is the importance of targeting a set of grade-level Common Core state standards in whatever area you're working on. And I should point out, the rubric that you have in front of you is focused on grades 3 through 12 English language arts. There's a rubric for pre-K through 2 English language arts and rubrics for math also. So we're working with the English language arts grades 3 through 12 rubric. So again, the importance of targeting standards at the right grade level, the importance of a clear and explicit purpose for instruction, and the importance of selecting text that is within those stretched lexical bands. And the reason I'm talking about text complexity is that for English learners, those bands give you a lot of leeway in a sense. So if you look at the text that we're working with, it's Lexile at 1130, and it says it's in the stretch 6-8 band. It's also in the stretch 9-10 band. So this particular piece of text could be used for students all the way from grade 6 to grade 10, which would make it a good piece of text for students who are ELs at the higher levels. And the leeway it gives educators to choose text that's sort of closer to students' zones of proximal development, but the importance of, and because the Lexile measure isn't as good as sort of the human eye, an informed human eye about text complexity. You pick up a piece of text, you can pick up text as an educator, Lexile at the same level, and realize that the complexity is really pretty different because the Lexile framework just takes a couple of factors into consideration, and there are many more factors that make text complex. So one of the things we like to do is to train educators in sort of looking at text to determine what is it qualitatively that makes text complex, because again, it's very important to start with text, especially for students who are struggling, that is within those Lexile bands, but more manageable. And one way to figure that out is with the Lexile framework, right? And there's a lot of leeway there. But the other is really just sort of informed choices by informed educators. So I'm going to do this. If we're going to, and sort of a little bit of a systematic approach to trying to figure out what is it that makes text complex. So here we go. And I do this presentation is framed sort of what do we need to think about for all students? And then in addition to that, what do we need to think about for English learners? And as you're listening to me, because I'm going to have you talk with each other after each section of this presentation about, I'm talking about English learners, how do you apply this to the particular other populations that are at risk? I'm going to talk about all students, I'm going to talk about English learners, and I want you then to think about, okay, what additional or what different should we be doing to support other groups of students who are at risk, because there's a large gap between sort of how they happen to be doing in English language arts and what the expectations are for them, okay? So think about that as I'm talking. So for all students, what is it that makes text complex? Well, words with multiple levels of meaning. English is one of those languages where there are many words that have more than one meaning. Some of those words are what we call polysemes in English. So the words have different meanings, but the meanings are related. So for example, the word bank and bank. You have a bank, which is a place to keep money, but you also have a bank means to rely on someone. So if students sort of understood sort of one meaning, they could be helped to figure out the other. But some words are homonyms. So they sound alike, right? They're spelled alike, but they have very different meanings. So the word bank and bank, right? A bank is a place to keep money, and then we have a riverbank. So this adds to the confusion, right? So some words are related in meaning, and kids can sort of, if they know one meaning, they can sort of figure out the other. Some words are homonyms, and really they have very different meanings. And if just think about all the words in English, sometimes I do this as an exercise, you can almost every sort of word in English that is a straightforward word has multiple meanings. The word can, for example, just has come to mind as I'm talking. So that's one thing that adds complexity to text. Another is nominalization. And if we're native speakers and and we're adults, we realize that if we see a verb that's been turned into a noun, we know that it more or less has the same meaning. It's a different part of speech. So implementation. If we see that word, we understand its meaning. If we see the word implement, we'll know what it means. It turns out that this is a skill that students have to acquire. So nominalization is when verbs, adjectives, and adverbs are sort of turned into nouns. And students really need to be helped to understand that this is the case. And I'll show you examples of this as we move forward. So for example, the word implement and implementation, sometimes you have to add a suffix to change the verb into a noun, and sometimes it's the same thing. So the word help can be a noun or a verb. Unfamiliar vocabulary, students need to know about 95% of words in text. Of course, it depends on how familiar they are with the text they're reading, right? This is just an estimate for them to really understand the text. So vocabulary turns out to be important. Archaic language, some text has archaic language, figurative language, so example, irony, idioms, metaphor, other literary devices can make text much more complicated for ELLs. If you pick up text and work with it, some text has lots of idiomatic expressions. It's just how the author writes. And so maybe not a good idea to pick that text for students who are struggling anyway. Text with non-standard dialects, text with multiple levels of meaning. So some text can be taken at face value, whether others are more like onions with multiple layers of meaning. Distortions in organization of text can be very complicated for kids. So, for example, a lot of texts don't follow chronological order. They're flashbacks, there's foreshadowing. But also in text, there are different voices or points of view. So for ELs, for example, a lot of dialogue can be hugely confusing because kids lose track of who's saying what. And so again, picking text with lots of dialogue for kids that are struggling may not be the best thing to do unless you plan to spend a lot of time sort of helping the kids understand, who is saying what. But also distortions in organization of text can relate to the use of multiple tenses, for example, in one sentence where things occur in the past and in the present, and kids sort of lose track of what the meaning is. Specialized or technical knowledge. To me, this is one of the main things that makes text complex. And with informational text especially, if students don't have the background they need, the content knowledge they need, even being able to read that text fluently doesn't really help them. And in fact, just knowing vocabulary words doesn't help them either. They have to really understand the concepts that are embodied by that text. So again, one of the challenges with the Common Core State Standards is the call for a lot more informational text, especially as students go up the grade levels, and to think hard about, well, how much knowledge other knowledge do kids need to have to be able to understand this text. And finally, limited use of text features and graphics. So some text has headings, subheadings, visuals, signal words, diagrams, and some text doesn't. So again, these are things that make text harder or easier. So here's an example with the text that you all are working with. And remember, I'm talking about all students here, not English learners, not a specialized group. So for example, words with multiple levels of meaning. The word some in this passage can mean about, sort of an estimate of, but it can also mean a few. The word mall could be very confusing for students because those people who aren't familiar with Washington, D.C. are going to think that this passage is about a shopping mall, not about the D.C. mall. Great voice. So the word great here can have lots of different meanings. It can mean a big voice, a good voice, an important voice. It's not specified. And the word demonstrate here means to show, but it also can mean to engage in a public gathering for or against something. So again, there are a lot of different meanings to some of these words. Nominalization, we talked about this a minute ago. The words turnout and support are used as nouns, but they also can be used as verbs. Unfamiliar vocabulary, these words may be challenging for all students, anticipating enlisted risk. And by the way, these words are words that come up if you run this text through the academic word list highlighter, and I don't think, well, probably I actually will show you how that works. But again, these are words that appear in post-secondary level text very frequently in content areas. So they're general academic words that appear frequently in content area text. And it's likely that lots of kids don't know them. Figurative language, whipped in and great voices. Great voice is a good voice, but it refers to Marian Anderson. Whipped in is figurative language related to wind. Text with multiple meaning, we did that. Well, actually, so again, great voice refers to Marian Anderson. as a person as well as her voice, demonstrate their support. So again, they're showing their support, but it is also a demonstration. So the words are very strategically selected. Distortions in organization of text. So we've got the present progressive and the past perfect in the first example here, or the past and the past perfect can be challenging. Specialized content area knowledge, the National Park Service, the law, racial justice. These are all concepts that, if students don't have them, they don't really understand these things, it's going to be very hard for them to make sense of this text. Okay, so I've quickly gone through sort of giving people a sense of, okay, if you're going to pick text, one thing you can do is try to think about these things in deciding what text to use with particular groups of students. So for English learners, there are additional challenges, and I think that these same challenges apply to other students who are really struggling. So one is at the lexical level. So we call out sort of the word level, the sentence level, the discourse level, but these levels actually there's a lot of overlap. So for ELs, there are a greater number of unfamiliar words and phrases. And one of the things that we learned in our research, we followed pre-K students from pre-K all the way through grade 8. And these students were in English-only environments. They were in Massachusetts and Maryland, states with high standards. And what we found with these ELs is that they were 2 to 3 years below in vocabulary knowledge at pre-K, and at grade 8, they were still 2 to 3 years below. And this is because even though they were gaining vocabulary at faster rates than students that were English proficient, because all the other students were also acquiring vocabulary, they were still behind. So again, it really argues for some pretty intensive vocabulary development at young ages. There's been some really interesting research about oral language development in children as young as 1, and the kinds of mother-child talk that's really going to develop language. And that's a whole nother topic that's really interesting. I really think we need to start this before students sort of get to kindergarten. If we're going to close this gap, we're going to have to think about how to help parents develop students' language, whether it's in a first language or a second. If these are homes where children speak another language, the same methods work, because if the students have strong first language vocabulary, they're going to transfer that knowledge to the second language. So that research, to me, is research from Stanford University. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's really interesting research about the differences in sort of mother talk with students who are with children, usually from high poverty families, compared to children from more advantaged homes. But also, what's interesting to me is not just that sort of there's different mother talk, but the idea of putting interventions in place, which is what people are doing now, to really develop students' oral language before they get to school. And our research shows these students were in English-only environments, pre-K, 2 to 3 years behind. By the time they got to grade 8, they were still 2 to 3 years behind. And this is even though they were developing vocabulary at faster rates. So, we, in the public school system, we can't do it all. I mean, I really think the idea of sort of parent engagement and parent involvement earlier on is going to be critical to helping us close this achievement gap with students. I want to put that out there. And that's why this research to me is so important, because not only it documents sort of the differences in parent talk, but sort of the methods that we can use to really help parents develop this oral language in children before they get to pre-K. I mean, we started watching these kids in pre-K. They were all in Head Start classrooms. It's not like they were not. We were doing as much as we could for them, and it wasn't enough. And when you think about reading comprehension being predicated, vocabulary is the biggest determinant of reading comprehension in mainstream kids and English language learners. It's a very robust body of literature. And if that's the case, we're going to have to do something sooner. We really are. So that's just, I want to put that out there. But for English learners, again, they're going to encounter a greater number of unfamiliar words and phrases. And some of these words and phrases are connective, which are things we tend not to teach. So connectives link ideas or thoughts. So they can be coordinating conjunctions like and or but conjunctive adverbs that connect verb phrases such as furthermore, however. They're really important because they connect propositions, they connect meaning, they make meaning out of sort of parts of a sentence. And we did, I wish I had video clips. I always stand up here and I'm talk, and I wish, because I know we've got video clips of some of these things, and one of these days I'm going to stop talking and actually start inserting some of these video clips into my presentation. We actually did an intervention with second grade students in high poverty schools in Houston, and we taught the students connectives, and they really learned them, complicated connectives, by having the kids act out sort of what was happening in a sentence related to the connective while it was going on. I have some wonderful visuals of this, and I keep thinking I've got to insert one because it's just amazing. And our research shows that they actually acquired connectives. So we know how to do it. We know how to do it with young children. We don't do it, and again, it's barrier to comprehension. For ELs, complex set syntax, again, this is a real challenge for them. So we've got sentences, compound sentences that have two or more independent clauses, or complex sentences that have an independent clause and one or more dependent clauses. This really, really makes text complicated. So we have some methods we use to help students with complex syntax. We use systemic functional analysis, which I probably won't get into in this talk. But I don't, I do this about what makes text complex, and it makes people after a while like sort of think, oh my God, what do we do about this? But actually we do have methods that we can use to sort of help students deal with this, and so it's important to point out what the complexity is, but we also have methods that we can use to sort of help students make sense of text and learn strategies independent of direct instruction to do this. At the discourse level, a difficulty for English learners are these reference chains, and a reference chain tracks a single character, idea, or concept throughout the text. Usually the first link introduces the character or idea by name and gives some other details, but then subsequent links give less information, so they may be pronouns, for example. So in this example here, and as the crowd grew, so you can see that if students are reading, they see the crowd, they don't know that it refers to the crowd, and this really makes things confusing. But it's not just what we call anaphora. They're concepts connected with each other that are not named or are named differently. So if you look at I don't know if you can see them, but stretching around both sides of a long reflecting pool refers back to the crowd. It's what the crowd was doing. And also the phrase extending beyond the base of the Washington Monument also refers to the crowd. And so if students don't understand that these phrases refer to the crowd, they're going to be totally confused about what's going on here. So this is a big challenge for English learners. One of the ways we deal with this is to ask students questions, to teach them about this, and we do that. We teach them about referential chains and anaphora so that they can use these strategies to make sense of the text, but we also ask them questions that force them to connect these different parts of speech. So, okay, so here's my little example with ELLs, and then I'm going to have you spend 5 minutes or so talking in your group. So for English learners, we've got the same words that we did for English proficient students, but we've got other words too that are going to be really challenging. So I want to just point out things like gathered on, bundled up. These are phrases, so it's important not just to focus on words, but phrases. These are phrasal verbs, and in English, one of the great complications is you can have a verb that's very simple, add a preposition to it, and you totally change the meaning. Get on, get up, get in, get over. All those phrasal verbs have different meanings, totally confusing to English learners. So teaching them get doesn't get you anywhere. Okay. As an example. So gathered on, to gather up, it means something different. But there are other words that English proficient students might know that these ELs might not know. So connectives, So here we've got connectives by and when, and those connectives by and when connect those phrases to this clause about the estimated 75,000 people. So it tells, when the 75,000 people were sort of gathering. So if students don't know the word, understand by and when, they're not going to understand how they sort of support this clause, an estimated 75,000 people gathered on the mall. And then and here is connecting two different independent clauses. Complex syntax, the whole thing is complex. So you've got these first three sentences have many dependent phrases, and then the final sentence has a compound verb separated by several noun phrases. So they had come on this chilly Easter Sunday to hear, to demonstrate, and they're separated by noun phrases. And reference chains, okay? So the 5 o'clock refers to sort of when the concert was going to start. They bundled up and demonstrate refer to 75,000 people. So just a little sort of foray into what makes text complex. And one of the things, again, with teachers, we've got to teach teachers to sort of have the tools they need to figure these things out. We can't script everything for them, which is why I really got into professional development. So I was a teacher for 10 years. I was a researcher I did policy work. I was a researcher for 15 years. And, now doing a lot of professional development, trying to figure out how to give teachers the tools they need to sort of make the right decisions. Now, in terms of English reading opportunities, and I want to talk something about, just a little bit about this, the first part of the EQUIP rubric. What I've been talking about is the importance of sort of strategically selecting text within those stretch bands that's going to be more manageable. But we have to, and I really believe in the standards, but I part with the standards a little bit. And that is, we have to give ELs opportunities for wide reading. We really do. Okay, we have sort of instructional time where there's direct teacher instruction, but we have to figure out how to get these kids to read more. And we've got to give them text to read that they can, first of all, they want to read, and second of all, that is closer to their independent reading levels. Otherwise, it's through reading text that they're really going to acquire vocabulary, and they're going to really acquire the domain knowledge they need. And if we're not going to solve this problem, if all we're doing is spending 30 minutes a day in direct teacher instruction. Don't get me started on this, because the other thing that we do is we don't have our classroom structured in ways that make it possible for teachers to really work with the many different levels of students in that particular classroom. So when I work with districts, I always tell them, look, I have a method here that will work to support ELs in mainstream curriculum, but we have to figure out at the district level how to make it possible for teachers to do this. And we're not going to do it if we have we have a mainstream teacher who has special ed kids and ELs with 4 different levels of proficiency and gen ed kids in the same class. We're not going to do it. We're not going to do it if we have an EL specialist who's serving 5 different mainstream teachers, all with 2 kids here, 1 kid there, 3 kids there. To do this work right for this population of students really involves working with the district to structure instruction first so that it's manageable for teachers. We're putting them in situations that the best teacher in the world is going to have trouble. And newcomers is again, for English learners who are newcomers, this is not an orthodox thing to say, but I'm going to say it anyway, in my personality. I really don't believe in taking newcomers and having them read text at the 9th grade level. Like, what are we accomplishing there? We need to think differently about kids that are really at entering levels of proficiency. What those kids need is to learn how to read in English. We're putting kids into situations where they cannot sort of read text fluently. So we've got to figure out something different for these kids. And the idea that kids can just just sort of figure out how to read, it doesn't work. It does for some kids, but for many, they really need explicit instruction. So we need something different for newcomers. We need to teach them to read. We need to teach them to read fluently, and we need to give them text where we're focused on the same standards, but they can actually manage the text a little bit better than text that is sort of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 levels above what they can do. So that's sort of what I want to say about that. The reason I have this up here is that there are some methods for sort of figuring out, sort of finding this text. So for assessing students' Lexile levels and finding the names of text, you can go to Lexile.com, but these are EdSphere, Nucella, and ReadWorks actually help teachers find text at different levels. So Nucella teachers really like because it's informational text, it's all news articles, and it calls up news articles on a particular topic, and then teachers can actually click on the level of the text they want. So they have the same text Lexiled at 3 or 4 or 5 different levels, I think, and it's all informational. ReadWorks does the same thing. So I have other resources here, but they don't actually give teachers the text. They just tell teachers, okay, if you want to, text it, Lexiled at 500, here are all the text at Lexiled that level. But what teachers really need are the actual resources, not just sort of information about what text. So here are some sites. EdSphere is actually a product of Metametrics, and Metametrics is the organization that developed the Lexile framework. So, I put this out there because EdSphere also, with a subscription, gives educators access to lots of text at different levels, Lexile levels, and also includes activities, online digital activities that develop students' vocabulary and comprehension. So I just put that out there. For English learners, it's important to make home language literature available to those ELs that are literate. And so here's 80% of the kids in the U.S. who are second language learners are from homes where Spanish is the first language. So here the Lexile folks have a system here to help find text at in Spanish Lexile to students' Spanish Lexile levels. And so some students also can't read the text, but they can understand it. So to the extent you can find audio tapes available to ELs is also a good thing. Sometimes the curriculum that people have available actually has digital resources. They have oral versions in the first or second language, and teachers just don't make that available to kids, and so that's another thing to do. All right, so now it's your time, and I get to stop talking for 5 minutes. So here's my little graphic organizer, reading text closely, text-based evidence. So the idea here, and you can look at your rubric if you want to, this is that second column, is the idea of reading closely and answering a sequence of text-dependent questions, academic vocabulary, building academic vocabulary throughout instruction, and writing from sources, which means to draw evidence from text to produce clear and coherent writing. And the 3 types of writing required by the new standards are writing that informs, explains, or makes an argument. So as we go through this section, I want you to think about how well these supports might help ELs as well as other students challenged by these shifts. Are there additional supports that might help them? So I'm going to start with reading text closely. I'm going to give you a chance to talk. Then I'll talk about academic vocabulary. I'll give you a chance to talk. And then about writing the sources and give you a chance to talk. So here we are reading text closely, text-based evidence. And again, what are the additional supports we provide for English learners? And again, these are supports that I think help all students. One is we present text in smaller chunks. The other is we engage students in multiple readings. And we also provide for ELs support in the form of supplementary questions. So I'll talk about that. We always have guiding questions for sort of each section of text, but we have developed supplementary questions that through answering them, you give kids access to you give kids the ability to answer the guiding questions. So these supplementary questions, sentence starters, sentence frames, and word banks. And so again, the level of scaffolding for ELs really depends on their level of proficiency. It's not a homogeneous group. So for example, for all students, how do we manage this new shift to close reading? It's interesting. When I gave this talk in Iowa, and I should stop getting distracted here. But, but a teacher, I had to talk. This was really challenging. It was a talk in front of 350 people in a high school cafeteria where there was no podium, and there are like these little screens in like 6 places around the room. So I just had to get into my teacher mindset. Oh, I'm in a school, which was good. I was a teacher for 10 years, so get very resourceful. But what the teacher asked me was, what is close reading? What are people talking about? And it really sort of struck me that nobody's really defined close reading and what it is for these teachers. And so I tried to explain to her it's really just helping students understand what they are reading. Close reading is, sort of working with kids through a text to help them comprehend the text and making sure that the questions you ask them really require them to go to the text for information. She said, "Oh, thanks, now I get it." And it was amazing. This was after my talk, too, which really gave me pause. I spent like about, 30 minutes talking about close reading. So anyway, I thought maybe this is a different audience. Fortunately, she was the only one that asked me that. But I thought maybe I should start out by defining close reading. And I said, look, it's what we all sort of used to do before we started with all this strategy business, where reading was about strategies, right? It was about visualization. It was about you getting the main idea. It was about, and that stuff actually is important. But, all that research is based on, students with learning disabilities. Nobody ever proved anybody else needed that to comprehend text. And then what happened is we went from that to not even having it applied to the text. Publishers would do these exercises about get the main idea, but they wouldn't apply it to the passage. They teach a skill, and then it was a skill. And I think it was very convenient. People thought, oh, I just have to teach these 5 strategies, and then kids can understand what they read. That would be good. That would really be good. So they sort of forgot about helping kids really understand the text or build the domain knowledge they, needed, or actually be able to read the words fluently. So I explained to her, we're sort of back to trying to sort of help kids make sense of the text and answer questions about the text. And so what we've done here, and also, since I have been working with teachers for 3 years around the standards, these standards are really difficult to understand if you're not like a high school English language arts teacher. I'm not. So half of these standards, I really don't know what they mean. I was trained in cognitive science and second language acquisition. And so a lot of these questions have to do with literary analysis. The people who understand that are English language arts teachers. So first off, I'm not going to get into anecdotes here about how I sort of dealt with this early on, which was to find a really good English language arts teacher, and I've continued to work with him. But we've taken the standards and actually translated them, and I call it a translation, right? Because what do these things really mean? We've translated them into generic stems, and then we've modeled how to apply these generic stems to actual text. So we had to do this because the way you help the kids meet the standards is to ask them questions that are standards aligned. So to do that, you need generic stems, and you need to give teachers an understanding of how to apply those generic stems to real text. So I've worked with this. He's an English language arts teacher who happened to help develop the standards. We work very closely together now. So we took every standard, grade 2 through grade 12, for reading literature and reading informational text, and we created generic stems, and we're creating sort of models of how to apply those stems to real text. So we've gotten, in terms of the models, we've had to get copyright permission for every single text that we want to use. So we're almost there, but it's taken 1.5 years. But we've done this for a lot of texts, and I'm glad to share these generic stems and their instantiations with anybody who wants them. So the first thing we have to do is we've taken these standards. So these are key idea and detail standards, standards 1 through 3, and we've turned them into generic stems that make more or less sense. So for example, if you look at 8.3, analyze how a text makes connections among and distinctions between individuals, ideas, or events. So my thought was, what does that mean? Like, what are you talking about? So But if you think about it as, how is this event, individual or this event or this idea introduced and portrayed in the text, it makes a lot more sense, right? Or how did this individual or event idea relate to this other individual event idea? So we've done that, and so if you look at how we apply it to the voice, which is the text I made you read, is you can just ask the question, why had so many people come to the concert? And it's an important question because it really gets to the heart of what is going on in that text about people demonstrating for racial justice. So we're trying to pick questions that are standards aligned, but also really get students to the heart of what that text is about. So craft and structure, again, to me those questions are, that this is really challenging, but you can take these standards, turn them into generic stems, and then actually give examples. So for example, if you look at the 8.5, analyze in detail the structure of a specific paragraph in a text, including the role of particular sentences in developing and refining a key concept, you can turn that into how does a particular sentence or paragraph or chapter or section connect to the overall structure of the text. And our instantiation of that is explain how the words Friedman uses in the first two paragraphs set the scene. That's really important. That's what those first two paragraphs are about. There's a lot of description of it was really chilly despite it being cold. There were lots of people. The people who were there were very different kinds of people. They weren't rowdy, right? There were families, there were children, there were Boy Scouts. So it's the words he uses are very important in sort of setting a scene. It was a peaceful demonstration, and also there were lots of people. They were jammed. There were 75,000 people there. So if you want to get into literary analysis, this is one way to do it. So I have to say, because I haven't said this, you have the same standard, and this is really important. If you look at the standards, they talk about the importance of sort of the quantitative text, right, the qualitative aspects of text, but also matching reader to task and text. And I never understood what that meant. Because if you have to make kids read within these lexile bands, right, and they have to meet the same standards, what are we talking about when we're saying, match reader to task and text? So I called Sue Pimentel, who's a colleague of mine, and she wrote the standards. I figured I'd ask her. And she told me, and I was really surprised by her answer, and I actually have her answer embedded into some of my talking points, which was there are lots of different ways to meet the same standard. So think about it. For ELs, for example, summarizing, you want them to summarize a piece of text. You might ask them to summarize a short paragraph. Whereas for kids who are more proficient in English, you might want them to summarize across 4 or 5 paragraphs. This is an easy instantiation of what I'm talking about. But we can take these craft and structure standards that are really challenging and figure out ways to meet them so they're not over the top hard. What I've seen in terms of, people who are out there developing these curriculum is they're asking kids to do things that are really difficult to meet a particular standard where you could actually ask them to do things that were easier that would meet the same standards. So that's enough of that. But I think it's important to bring out. So we've got intro text or questions or text dependent. You can see here the difference between, since you're all reading this while I'm talking, the difference between non-text dependent questions and text dependent questions. The reason for this, and we all know why, because we're all educators, is that teachers have been put in the position for many years of working with kids at 10 different levels, and to do this, they never have kids read. They read the text, the kids listen, and then they have great conversations with kids about the text because you can ask questions where the kids don't really have to even understand the text. So I've been in classrooms with whole classroom conversations around other things where kids can just answer the questions based on sort of, what they knew before they were exposed to the text. And that's what, there's this big focus on text-dependent questions. I have to say here, just one other caveat. I really believe in this idea of text-dependent questions, but there is a type of question, again, I'm not totally orthodox about things that I think is important. And those are questions that may not be text-dependent, but ask kids that sort of activate kids' prior knowledge, background knowledge, because doing that, I was trained in cognitive science. It really does. If you activate that background knowledge, it's going to really help kids understand what they're reading. That's not a text-dependent question. But you know what? I'm telling teachers those questions are important because they will help kids sort of understand what they're reading, and that is not text-dependent. We divide text. Okay, so now we're talking about ELs, but this applies to all other kids also. We chunk the text. Teachers can give kids 5 pages of text to read. The kids sit there for, 20 minutes. They don't understand anything. So we take small sections of text. We have the kids work through that text before we go to the next section. And, it's sort of a qualitative thing how you do this. We divided the text because the first part is describing the scene. The second part is about Marian Anderson. There are lots of different ways to do this. The other thing is we engage students in multiple readings. Now look, we have a model here that teachers apply this model as it works for them. We do there's a lot of emphasis on cold reading. Okay, to comply with that, we agree, if you have to do a cold read, choose a small piece of text, turn it into a pre-assessment. So at least you're giving teachers information about what kids know and don't know. And for ELs, we say it includes some questions that the kids can answer and provide the same level of support for this pre-assessment as you would for the kinds of instruction kids are getting. If it's framing, you provide that. So the first read might be a cold read where the kids read independently and answer questions. We have the teacher read aloud the text. And I was actually reviewing some video clips that our WETA is doing with some teacher lessons that we implemented in Poughkeepsie, and teachers did a wonderful job of showing this. So we give teachers glossaries with the words that are challenging. We have teachers do a first read, and what they do is they have the glossary, they're reading aloud, kids are following as the teacher reads, and the teachers are swapping in, they're sort of defining the words as the teacher reads. I thought originally this wasn't going to work, but it's amazing. So that way, you don't spend, 50 minutes of the class period, teaching vocabulary, which is another thing we have to get away from. These kids need a lot, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But again, we have that first read where the teacher reads aloud to demonstrate native speaker fluency and teach vocabulary. Then we come up with these supplementary questions. We give them to kids. They work in partners or pairs to answer the questions to get them through the text. They've got their glossary. They've listened to the text. They have framing, and I'll show you this in a minute. So we have that first close read that the students engage with. If teachers want, they could send the kids back through the text to reread it and note vocabulary and details they might not understand, and there's a classroom discussion about that. The second close read, we focus on craft and structure and integration. So we do this first read where the kids actually work for the text for comprehension and go back and then focus on these literary analysis questions and integration questions. So the idea of supplementary questions here is that, as I said, they sort of guide kids to the guiding questions that are more overarching. And for ELs with lower levels of proficiency, we might also give them sentence starters, sentence frames, and word banks. I'm going to show you this in a minute. It's also important to make sure kids understand what the question is asking. So start with that. So here, supplementary questions inquire about word meanings as well as larger sections of the text. We supplement them to support ELs' understanding of the main idea, and we make it easier for ELs to answer them by, and I'll show you this, these are little techniques we use, defining keywords prior to asking a question, or restating phrases or sentences that help students answer the question. So here's an example. Here's the passage. We sequence these questions. These kids will have these questions. They're working with a partner to answer these questions. They have a frame that looks like this in front of them that they're working with. And so we'll ask them what words. So the guiding question, again, is describe the scene as people began to arrive. So we ask them, which words describe the weather? What do they mean? And they've got a glossary. It says that people arrived despite the threatening weather. So we restate that first sentence. What does despite mean? What does this sentence mean? Again, it's important. It's that connective. that they need to learn. They've been pre-taught in our lesson what the word despite means, by the way, because we use different methods with words that are more complex, and I'll show you that in a minute. We restate phrases or sentences. It says that people arrived in large animated groups. What does animated mean? How did people arrive? And remember, the mall is a national park. Which words describe the streets leading to the mall? So all this sequence of questions gets the kids to the ability to answer this guiding question, which itself is important. It's meeting a standard, and it's key to the kids understanding the text. And again, this is very scaffolded. So this would be for ELs with sort of who are really at the more emergent levels of proficiency. But the words blank and blank describe the weather. We give them these frames, and we close, right? There's blanks there for the words that are most key to that particular sentence. So you can see what the answer is here, and you can see the level of scaffolding we're providing. And again, we go back to the guiding question. So this routine, the teacher asks the guiding question, the kids work with their supplementary questions, they answer them, the teacher debriefs the kids on the supplementary questions, and then asks the guiding question again. We don't frame up anymore the guiding question because we want kids to use their own words, right, to sort of to answer it based on their supplementary questions. So, okay, now it's your time to talk. And again, I want you to think about what is different for ELs with regard to close reading. What about students who might need additional support, and what are the implications for practice? Okay, I'll give you 2 or 3 minutes. We'll have a little debrief, and then we'll go on to vocabulary. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go on. Is that okay? Hello? All right, so I want to get through vocabulary and give you some time to talk about that. So again, we talked about text in smaller sections, multiple reading, supplementary questions, and some other support. Okay, academic vocabulary. So I'm going to fly through this because I really want to give you time to talk here. What is additional for ELs? They need support acquiring vocabulary that many English proficient students have already acquired. And again, this is something that lots of students who are struggling are going to need. But for ELs, one thing that is different is that they can bootstrap on their first language knowledge. So, for example, with languages that share cognate status with English, 1/2 to 1/3 of the words overlap in meaning. So if you can help students actually develop their first language knowledge and then teach them that they can sort of understand English words by thinking about words that are similar, that look alike and sound alike in their first language, are going to really help them. So cognates are words that sort of share meaning between languages, but also more or less sound the same and look the same. So again, between English and Spanish, for example, 1/2 to 1/3 of words sort of share cognate status. Okay, so we already talked about issues around vocabulary development in ELs. One thing that's really interesting is that 4,000 of the most frequent words in English account for about 80% of the words that readers encounter in text. So what I'm talking about here is how do we select vocabulary to start with, and then I'll talk a bit about how we teach it. So it makes sense, if we're going to spend time on vocabulary, to try to spend time on vocabulary that kids are going to see a lot in other texts. So this is an analyzer that we developed. So in our PD, we've also developed a bunch of tools for teachers. So this is a tool we've developed. If you put text into this tool, it will tell you which words are most frequent. This is based on a really extensive database of hundreds of thousands of words in text in English, K-12. And it's called the Educator Word Frequency Guide. I'm not going to get into all the details, but this really indexes text K-12. And you can see that the words in red are in the first quartile. They're the most frequent words in English. By the way, we pulled out of here the 100 most common words and we focus on, besides those, first, second, third, and fourth quartile words. So you can see, and to me it's interesting because it sort of maps on to levels of proficiency in a way, with the orange word sort of being sort of less frequent than the red words, the word would be demonstrate. So my colleague Kenji Hakuta also has a tool that he's developed called WordSift that I want to make you aware of. That is, again, the URL for it is here. He developed it with funds from the Council of Great City Schools, working with teachers in San Francisco. So you put text in his analyzer, It's a little different. The words that are large are words that appear frequently in that particular piece of text. So right now, this isn't indexing anything except the particular piece of text. But you could also sort common to rare, and this will show you, for those words that are frequent in this text, how frequent are they in other texts. So the other texts are about 142,000 texts that are digital in Project Gutenberg. So here, the word great is the most frequent word, right? Of the frequent words in this passage, great is the most frequent word in English, and singly is the least frequent. You can also sort according to the General Services List, which indexes words that are sort of 2,000 most frequent words in English. The words in red are the words that are most frequent in English. You can sort according to the academic word list, which I'll show in a little bit. That indexes words in post-secondary texts that are highly frequent in content area subjects. This is what I was talking about before, right? General academic words that appear in content area subjects. Assemble and despite are the words that appear. You can sort by language arts, science, math, or social studies. This is social studies. This is based on some work Marzano did. So the social studies words here are nation, national, Washington, and monument. It also provides a visual graphic, sorts words according to sort of clusters of meaning. This is the academic word list highlighter. We just talked about WordSift, which also references the academic word list highlighter. This is the academic word list highlighter, which I really like to use at the secondary levels, because again, these are highly frequent words kids are going to need to read post-secondary text. They're very frequent in content area text, and they're general academic words. So here you can see in this text the words that are called up from the academic word list. But you know, its frequency isn't the only thing. You've got to really think about how important these words are to understanding the text. And so we really first think about which words do kids really need to understand to make sense of the text they're reading. So to do that, we usually come up with our text-dependent questions. Based on those questions, we figure out which words the kids really need to know. Okay, so again, frequency and meaning. Meaning's important for a particular piece of text. Frequency is important because those may be the words you want to reinforce over time, because you know kids are going to encounter them a lot in other texts. What about methods? One thing that I really take issue with this new practice guide I told you to look at is its emphasis on sort of intensive vocabulary instruction. And I just, you know, sometimes I think researchers don't have common sense. I really don't. Being one, but also being like really a practical person. So this advice that you have to like concentrate a lot on just a few words, it's like, really? No, that's not really, because with ELs, if you do that, they're not going to understand the text. You've got to really concentrate on lots more words. And also in research, you know, some researchers are really good at getting great results. You have one teacher teaching 3 students, teaching 5 words over a month, okay? Right? You know what I'm talking about, right? Oh, you get great results. So then they look at the studies with these great results, and what do they find? You know, you've got like, you know, 5 kids in a group, and you teach the same words for 5 months, and yeah, the kids learn them. But then you think about reality. We need to teach these kids lots of words. And fortunately, I'm more practical, and our research has shown, which was a big surprise to me, that you can actually, kids acquire a lot of word meanings without intensive instruction. So if I say to people, if I stopped presenting so much and actually sat and wrote out my results, maybe that practice guide would be more sensible. Because it shows that you can use less intensive instruction and get a lot of mileage. And we found this in language arts and also in science. So we reserve our more intensive instruction for more abstract words, and this is also research-based findings. And we have a routine we use, which I'll show you in a minute. Less intensive instruction for more concrete words, and we really focus on student-directed learning. So for example, and you know, I show this routine, it's really important. I mean, this is like a lot of research. It looks simple, so people say, oh, I'll just do what I want. But I'm telling you, this really works, this routine, to teach kids complex vocabulary. And you don't have to do much, but just do this. So what we do is we use visuals. That's the point you made. For these abstract words, you need visuals. And actually, there's some research studies that show for ELs, The visuals are really important. Less important for English proficient kids. You need visuals. Pick visuals that really demonstrate the word's meaning. Not easy. My RAs go through 15 visuals before I say, okay, that one works. You've got to pick visuals that show the word meaning, and sometimes we have to combine pictures. So we start with a picture. If you start defining a word, the kids don't listen. Start with a visual, they'll look at it and they'll listen. So for example, look at the picture of the boy. The boy looks out the window and sees rain clouds. He brings an umbrella outside because he anticipates or expects that it will rain. Define anticipate. This is another problem we get into with teachers. They define words in ways that are harder than the target word, right? I see this, and in the textbooks, it's like, are you kidding? What good is that going to do? And the reason is that it's hard to define words in, using easier words. So if you want to do this, and I'll show you in a minute, we use wordsmith.net, wordsmyth.net, because it gives you different levels of definitions, but sometimes we have to then use Wordsmith to look up the words in the definition itself. It's hard to do this right. People don't do it right. So anticipate means to expect and prepare for something. We tell them what the word means in their home language. If we have those kids in a classroom, we tell them if it's a cognate. We talk about the meaning of the word in the particular story, because sometimes kids don't generalize. You can give them a definition, but then you put them in the story and they have no idea what the word means in that story. So we have to bring that in. We do partner talk. Partner talk is based on the age or grade of the kid. This was middle grade, so we give them something they want to talk about. So here, tell your partner about a time when you anticipated you would have a good time and you did. So just a simple routine, and it really does work. But here, for words that are less complex, we do, you just define it in context. That you thought the pre-reading with sort of swapping in definitions. Threatening weather means it looks like it's going to be bad weather. You don't need 15 minutes of instruction on the word threatening. And that's what teachers are doing now, because they can do it. And it's easier than working with the text itself. So anyway, assemble means to gather or come together. Just show pictures. You don't need 15 minutes on the word jammed. Look, people are jammed together. That's all the kids need, and they understand the word meaning. We've got to get kids better at, using strategies to unpack word meaning. So we teach them about context, about cognates, about context clues, about morphology. When we do mini lessons, we do them predicated on the text that they're using. So we model these strategies on the text, and we give them a chance to apply these strategies to the particular text. Have the kids, have them use their smartphones. They're, wordsmith.net, Spanish.dictionary.com, translate.google.com. You can give them these resources to use so they can look up words they don't know. It's a little tricky because it's hard to figure out, map the word definition to the meaning in the particular text, which calls for some instruction on dictionary use, a lot of instruction on dictionary use. Here are some smartphone apps for Androids and iPhones. And word learning strategies for this particular text. You could teach kids to use, to sort of apply context clues to threatening, because the text enables you to do that. The word cold, the weather was cold, and there's some other clues in there. Crowd, in the text, large groups and thousands of people. Concert and groups or cognates. We give kids glossaries to use so that they, and this is an elaborated form of it. You can take a look and see what it is. The word, we have the kids rewrite the word when they encounter it. We provide an English definition and an example, and we have the kids some other time come up with their own phrase and indicate if the word's a cognate. So I'm going to give you just a couple minutes to talk about vocabulary, and then we're going to debrief, okay? Okay, so I've got notice that we have a real hard stop at noon here. So why don't we, so I'm really sorry not to give you much time with this. So what I'd like to do is take just a couple of comments about vocabulary, tell you what else is in my presentation, which I'm not going to get to, but you'll have access to that. So what we're not going to get to is writing, unfortunately, but again, it's pretty clear in the presentation the kinds of supports we provide for writing, which are to rewrite the prompt so it's comprehensible, and it's to provide graphic organizers to help kids pull out information from the text they're going to have to use to write to, and then paragraph frames. And then the other thing, I talk about some additional supports for ELs, instructional supports, and I talk about prior to reading, developing students' background knowledge. It's really important, but making the background knowledge instruction very concise, specific to the text, very short passages specific to the text, and scaffolded in the same way that you scaffold instruction for the close reading. So, and make sure the background does not give away the text. Short pieces, we use visuals, pictures, we use video clips, very short, specific to the text, scaffolded in the same way. And then the final thing that I wanted that you'll see if you look through the rest of this presentation is because we're working with kids that may not have acquired the precursor skills, we have organized the standards by standard from grade K all the way through grade 12. So you can start with easier instantiations of the standard and then think about, okay, if I have a 7th grader, and the standards aren't all that different from one grade level to the next. So start with an easier version of the standard in your class at the beginning of the year or in the classes that you're sort of helping teachers with, and then help students sort of acquire the more complex instantiation of the standard during the school year. So that's what this rest of this presentation focuses on. Writing, which is one of the sort of the last sections of sort of key shifts, right? Reading, vocabulary, and writing. And then additional support, where I focus on both developing background knowledge in students and this idea of learning progression. So we did the National Literacy Panel. We had a panel of experts we brought together, reviewed all the research from 1980 through 2002. For the particular question about, what do we know about native language instruction compared to English-only instruction, we did a very systematic review, and we started with studies that were published in 1926. And we looked at not just peer-reviewed literature, but technical reports. We did comprehensive search. We found, 100 studies. We had very strict methodological requirements. We winnowed it down to those studies that met these requirements, and I can't go into them now because this is published in our book we did, Developing Literacy in Language Minority Children. And what we found was that programs that used native language instruction were superior to programs that used only English instruction in developing English literacy outcomes in English learners. The effect size was about 0.35. That effect size was stronger than any of the effects you saw in any of the other intervention research. So again, if you want a method that's really going to support second language learners, it's really, and I'm just talking now about developing English literacy, it's developing their native language literacy skills. It's really important, but it's also important for identity, it's important for economics, it's important for the ability to communicate between multiple cultures. I just can't, understate or overstate how important this is. And I don't have time to really talk about it, but I'm a strong advocate of bilingual instruction, of even, and I could talk about this for an hour, even within English instruction, trying to do all we can to support kids through working with them in their first language. Give them the text to read in their first language before they read it in English, right? Giving them these word definitions, in not just the word synonyms, but the definitions in their first language. Giving them opportunities to talk with each other in their first language before they have to report out in English. So to strategically embed sort of home language use and support throughout this basically English-only instruction. That's all I can say about it, but I can't sort of overstate its importance. And I think I'm going to be sort of slaughtered here if I don't close out. But there will be a chance. Thank you for that question. There'll be an opportunity, to talk to a bunch of experts in the panel discussion after lunch. So I just want to thank you guys. We're such a great audience. Thank you so much.